not my fault.
What's going on YouTube? Levi at Old Iron Off-Road out here today banging on Yogi. We'd mentioned in a previous video that we had some quote-unquote summer upgrades. We're going to dive into that today. Jumping back to the Road to Nationals video, I'm pretty sure my wife and myself almost suffered severe dehydration at the hands of July heat and the heat coming off of the trans tunnel of Yogi. Moving us into where we are today. Today, July, dehydration, heat. Hopefully you've put it all together. Mr. Yogi is getting an AC system, and I'm gonna walk you guys through start to finish how to install your very own AC system in your Scout or pretty much any other vintage vehicle, period. Let's dive into it. All right, now on a few things on the system that we're putting together, we have a more modern parallel flow condenser. We are opting to use the factory underdash unit. Now, a lot of times I actually recommend using an aftermarket system. Anything Scout, IH Parts America, and Scout Co. LLC, and I'm sure a couple of other vendors actually sell a really nice setup that is complete and you don't have the finickiness of some of the switches on the factory units. There are a lot of times issues that you run into reusing these factory units. The evaporator is usually pretty filthy. The expansion valve needs to be changed, which we do have one of those. That's a must. The rheostat knobs on the underdash unit are a little finicky and flaky, so there are some absolute benefits of going to just a completely new system. But again, I've parted out a bunch of Scouts and we have several of these in the shed, so we're gonna use what we've got. Again, we've got the upgraded parallel flow condenser. We have the factory evaporator, factory underdash plenum. We have a 7-valve Sanden compressor. This is an OE Sanden. New receiver dryer, an assortment of fittings. One thing you will have to pay attention to if you decide to use the factory underdash unit, the fittings on the underdash unit are not O-ring as the rest of the system is, so you will have to buy a couple of inverted flare style fittings for that to make all that happy. We have a Sanden conversion bracket. This is a bracket that my buddy at GRC cut out, and what this bracket does is it actually shifts the compressor into a location that instead of having to fiddle around with any kind of an adjustment on the top of the compressor mount itself, it puts the belt alignment in with the rest of the accessory drive so that you can actually use the swing of the alternator to adjust your belt tension. Makes it really nice and easy. And then if anything ever happens with the AC system, you just revert back to a standard set of belts, which we'll keep in the spare tool kit. And we also have a set of condenser brackets to make everything nice and tidy. So that's pretty much the gist of the kit. Obviously we've got to make our own hoses. We'll cover all that. But yeah, that's the nuts and bolts of the setup. So let's jump into it. So now that we've got the grill removed, first thing we're gonna do is mount up our evaporator condenser. I always do that. Condenser brackets onto the condenser, and then we'll get this guy fit up to the core. Hey, if you're still watching at this point, do us a favor, reach down, click the subscribe button. Make sure to click the bell icon for notifications when new videos are uploaded, and always hit the like button. Thank you. So we've got the condenser mounted. The next thing we're going to turn our attention to is the evaporator. Now, obviously, if you're going with the new unit, this is not something that you have to worry about. But with this old factory unit, there are a number of things that are going to actually cause you heartache when it comes to either airflow or inside of the evaporator being dirty itself. Now, with the modern system that we're using, it requires a different type of oil. The early systems used ester oil. The new systems use PAG, and I think there's even a newer oil now that is less likely to draw moisture. I'm not up on that, forgive me. You could always research it. Anyway, this has had ester oil in it. This is a functioning system, obviously. So there is some residual oil left in this evaporator. One of the things we're going to want to do is actually clean the inside of the evaporator out itself. And then we're also going to clean the inside of the plenum. Now, I'm assuming you can see the amount of debris that is stuck to the back of this guy. If you're using this type of AC in your Scout, it's a super good idea to go ahead and clean that off, because you're losing a huge chunk of efficiency of the evaporator core itself here, just for the simple fact that it can't pull air across it. So we're going to take the top cover of this guy off. We're going to flush the evaporator out itself, and we're also going to take some time and clean up the inside of this box. Another good thing to check out on the inside of these are the drains. A lot of times the drains get debris and moisture, and they actually rot off of these boxes. So we're just going to check the overall integrity of this case and make sure that it seems like it's functioning good and that it is as clean as it possibly can be. With the evaporator removed, you can see that there are some inherent issues with this design. One, there's this insulation stuck to the bottom of the case where water is going. Obviously, this stuff is going to suck up water and debris, and water is going to be trapped against that metal case. We're going to take this little piece out. We're going to leave the rest of the insulation alone. We're going to clean the bottom of this case out. And actually, overall, this case is in pretty darn good shape. I'm happy with this. Yeah, I dig it. I think we'll spray a little rust converter in there, clean that up a little bit, and I think we'll be in good shape. The evaporator itself is also really good, other than the external nastiness of it. So we're going to take this outside. We're going to blow it off really well, and I'll show you how to clean the inside of this evaporator core out. Alright, so we got the evaporator outside. First thing we're going to do is try to take care of some of this smuts on the face of it. Now to flush the inside of this guy out, I just use some starting fluid. Starting fluid seems to work really well. It evaporates, and it's got the ether actually really pulls the oil off the inside of this thing. Alright, so we got a nice clean evaporator. Our case is pretty clean. The bottom of it's been cleaned out and treated. I think we can stick this guy back together. So we've actually taken some time off camera just for the sake of speeding things up. We've gone ahead and mounted a few pieces of the system. We've got the compressor itself mounted. And you can see how this bracket allows you to utilize the alternator as adjustment. It keeps everything nice in line. We've also got the receiver dryer with a binary switch mounted. Anytime you're doing aftermarket AC work or even trying to refresh the factory system, it's a really good idea to add a binary switch. What the binary switch does is it adds a high-low pressure safety to minimize the effects of any low refrigerant or high head pressure might have on the actual compressor itself. Just acts as a kind of a fuse, a safety switch, if you will. Now, if you're running electric fans, there's also a thing called a trinary switch that will allow this switch related to pressures will actually cycle cooling fans on and off. So that's something to think about. And again, like I mentioned on the transcooler video, we've gone ahead and kind of roughly configured our hose fittings so we can get a good visual on line of sight and how we actually plan on routing our hoses. You see we've got a number 6 coming up to the grommet. We've got a number 8 coming out to the upper grommet. It's going to run into the high side of the compressor. Number 6 is going to come into the receiver dryer, out of the receiver dryer, and into the firewall. I actually saved this little doodad. And our low side is going into the firewall as well, where the evaporator / underdash unit resides. And we can actually start making some hoses at this point. Now, as I'm roughing in these hoses, one thing to keep in mind is as you're fitting all these up, especially if a fitting doesn't have a straight on one end, you really have to pay attention to how the fitting is rotated. So as you're making them, it's a good idea to take a paint marker and just put a little reference mark on the fitting and the hose itself. That way you can align it as you crimp it. And another thing to be aware of as you're assembling these hoses, these fittings also have a little depth gauge. There is a hole at the top of that fitting, and you need to make sure before you make your crimp that this hose is fully inserted and bottomed out in that guy. Again, you've got your reference mark and the little hole. Now we can crimp this guy. Now we've actually already gone ahead and crimped this one up, but I will go over a couple of things. Our crimp tool is a pretty basic Master Cool manual AC crimp set. It comes with your standard dies. It comes with a number 10, a number 8, up to a 12 and a 6. 12, I think I've only used, actually I don't think I've ever used a 12. Most of the time when you're working with AC stuff, you're going to be on automotive AC, you're going to be using 6, 8, and 10. Again, this is a Master Cool manual die set, and what that refers to is instead of a hydraulic means of crimping, it has just a screw. I will say this has been a really good kit. Now again, if you don't have this kit, if you're doing a one-off AC system and never planning on doing one ever again, you can also take and rough in your hoses, again making sure that you make a reference mark. Take them to a local automotive place that has the ability to do hydraulic hoses, and they will crimp your hoses for you for a minimal fee, I'm sure. But anyway, we've made one up. We're gonna put some O-rings on this guy, oil up the threads, oil up the O-rings, get this one bolted on. We've got a couple of more that we're gonna make, and then we'll be able to rough in the hoses that are actually going into the cap. All right, with most of the hardware installed and most of the hoses made up, we are gonna work out the 2 hoses on the evaporator itself. This thing's a little finicky to fit up the hoses just because of obviously with the dash being intact. Ideally, if the dash was out of it and we were doing a resto, it would be super quick to do. But the first thing we're gonna do is we're gonna actually go ahead and crimp these 2 hoses on the evaporator fittings itself. We'll put the evaporator in place, bolt everything up, and then we'll get an idea on distance on hose running to where they need to go. We've got one going to the receiver dryer, we've got another one going to the compressor. We can trim those off. We'll have to pull this guy back out. It'll make for a little more work, but at the end it'll make for a better finished product, and the hose runs will be nice and to length as they need to be. So we're gonna make that happen real quick, and after that we really have the majority of this system buttoned up. All right, so all our hose connections are made and tight. I think now we're at a point where we need to vacuum down the system and make sure that we don't have any leaks. That is one thing that you may end up having to do. If you do not have access to a vacuum pump, you may end up having to do your install. You can always take it to another automotive repair shop that is capable of AC, which most should be. They can vacuum down and charge your system by weight. We have a vacuum pump. Obviously, we do a lot of these, so that's something that we have the ability to do. Vacuum pumps and manifold gauge sets are very cheap and very affordable these days. So if you're somebody that likes to DIY, it may be worth your while just for the sake of doing it all yourself to go ahead and purchase your own set of manifold gauges and a vacuum pump. So by pulling a vacuum, we're doing two things. One, we're ensuring that the system doesn't leak. If we have a good solid vacuum with no movement, we are pretty sure that the system is solid and there's no chance of pressurized air escaping, pressurized refrigerant escaping. Another thing it does is it vacuums down and removes atmospheric air from the AC system, which is crucial for a proper functioning AC system. And three, it also does create a vacuum. Obviously, it's the term pulling a vacuum, but in the negative pressure, it actually causes moisture to boil and impurities to be evaporated from the system. So we're checking seal, we're pulling a vacuum so that refrigerant can actually be sucked into the system versus being pushed into the system, and we are boiling impurities. So we're gonna let this vacuum run, like I said, for about 2 hours, and then once we get that all back down, we'll shut the system off, and I like to let it set overnight for at least 10 hours. Come back, if we're still on hold in a rock solid 30 HGs of vacuum, we know without a doubt that there are 0 leaks on this system. So nothing to do now but let that happen. Back in the shop today, back on Yogi. We've gone ahead and taken the liberty of addressing a few things for the sake of speeding this video along. We've actually gone ahead and we have buttoned up the belt routing. We have buttoned up the wiring, and we have actually taken the plenum apart and cleaned up the switches and the rheostats for the high-low speed on the fan. Plenum is installed, as well as the vacuum has been setting for well over 24 hours at this point, and it's held a solid 30 HGs of vacuum. We also have our first can of refrigerant ready to rock and roll. One thing I am going to mention as a word of caution: you always charge one through the low side. You always charge through the low pressure side unless you're a professional and know what you're doing and have the equipment to charge through the high side. You always charge through the suction side. Second thing is, you can run the high side valve open so that you register high side pressure on your gauges. That is totally fine, but never open the high side valve on your gauges while you have one of these canisters hooked to it, especially after you've started charging the system and the system has built pressure. You will blow one of these cans up in your hand. I think we're at a point now where we can actually fire this guy up. We can put the first can of refrigerant in it and we can see how it goes. One thing that I do like to reference when I'm charging an AC system is ambient air temperature. We're going to be looking at high and low side pressures. But another more important thing in my mind is I'm going to be watching the receiver dryer. There's a little window in the top of it. I'm going to be watching that guy as I'm putting refrigerant in to look and make sure when all the bubbles are completely gone from the system. That's usually a good stopping point. Let's throw some refrigerant in this guy.
It's not my fault.
Well, YouTube, that about wraps this video up. Yogi will be blowing snow flurries this July, and I'm sure myself and my wife will both equally appreciate it when we're not melted in the floor. We've got some really nice videos, of course, planned for the not so distant future, and we really appreciate you at home taking the time to watch these videos. And as always, enjoy.